Hello and welcome to NexusForum Talks. Today we have a new session. This will actually be the last session in, let's say, in this round of NexusForum Talks. And as you already know, you can watch them all on our website and on our YouTube. So my name is Diana Medikuc. I am from F Success. Today I am joined by Ian Marsh from Rise, but I will let him introduce himself a little bit later, and I will take you through the, let's say, the overview of the project itself for those who are watching this for the first time. Allow me just a moment, Ian. Just let me know. I guess that it's sharing properly, right? You can see my screen.
I can, yes.
Amazing. Today we will be having the topic that falls under AI for Cloud Edge. But what does that mean? It means that we will go into depth of the topic, which is for today high value data sets for Europe. But before that, as I said, just having a brief overview of NexusForum project. So as you may have already known, NexusForum is an EU-funded project. In this past 2.5 years, we've been working on boosting the ecosystem of the European computing around the European computing continuum. And through different outputs of the projects, we have tried to kind of present a new vision in various directions and domains that this project tackles. So among the key outputs, you can also have a look at our policy recommendations, but also the roadmap that we have created with both the researchers, but also industrial players in the ecosystem. And we have held events also in Japan and South Korea. So expanding this output that we created not only from the perspective of the European Union and Europe in general, but also with our strategic partners. Today, as I mentioned, we are tackling a domain from one working group, but NexusForum actually has 10 working groups, and with each we have held these NexusForum talks. So this is also a chance to get some additional insights on the work that we have done. But I will skip to the main point. As I mentioned, Ian Marsh here with me today from Research Institute of Sweden. So, Ian, please go ahead and introduce yourself.
Thank you. I will just take over the sharing. I think you maybe just have to give me permission.
Of course, please go ahead.
Thank you. Okay, let's just see.
So yeah, for the time being, I cannot see your screen.
Oops. See here, so share. Now?
Yes, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Oops, So thank you very much for the introduction, Diana. It's very great to be part of this webinar series. I've listened to quite a few and probably even elongated some by some questions, and also to be the last one. So I'm going to talk a little bit about data, and in particular high value data. Why is it important? What has been done? And what we can do, and a small cheat sheet. Since we're only doing this, I got some questions, so I will try to answer them, or we can do this interactively with Diana. So I'm Ian Marshall from RISE, the Research Institutes of Sweden. For people who don't know, RISE is the National Research Organization. To some degree, we're a bit like a monopoly, to be honest. We do nearly all the research in Sweden, except mathematics and nuclear science, I was told. So we are about 3,000 employees, 420 million euro. The value here is in Swedish crowns because I stole this slide from the marketing. And people may know us from projects, but we assist Swedish national industry, of course. We're only, not of course, but we're 11 million people in Sweden with quite large industries. People may know Volvo, Electrolux, Scania, Henningsen, Spotify. So there's plenty of businesses there which may or may not need research, some do on their own, but we try to help Swedish industry where possible, as well as take part in national EU projects. This is one, NexusForum, where we're working on the roadmap for the next Cloud Edge continuum. a little bit about Rice, you can go to rice.ab or just send me a mail. About myself, I changed my logo from Minehead, which was as silly as this one, as do some group therapy. Actually, it's not really, it's doing stand-up comedy. But I'd just like to say, it's hard to summarize a career, but I've been doing research for nearly 40 years. And if there is one theme, and when making this slide, I didn't actually realize it before, and that is sort of data quality, well before AI. So I was working for a small company in the UK, as you can probably hear, I'm British, and that was doing graphics and image processing. There was data quality, obviously need quality to do both of those operations. In Hong Kong, I was working for Cathay Pacific, which was doing scheduling for airlines. You can imagine people don't turn up for planes, data is incomplete, flights get delayed. So handling imperfect data. In Australia, I used to work for the equivalent of RICE called the CSIRO, Swedish Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organization, where I worked on a programming language called R. And quite often we would work with incomplete data, that's mining data and materials. Australia is a large company and its research is very much focused toward Australia strong at mining, you name it, I won't go into all of them now. Then I moved to Germany and I worked with the internet in the early days. And surprisingly, internet in the early days didn't completely work. I'm not just about modems, I mean, data didn't come, it was late and delayed. So we worked quite a lot on that extensively in Germany, Sweden, and in the US. And more recently at Rice, I've been working with telecom protocols, and NexusForum's got quite a strong telecom presence. And how do you handle data in real time? So, for example, in this session, data, video, and audio is arriving. Does it break? Do you get those buffering signals? What do you do about that? I mean, people might not know this, but the internet's always been as good as it is now. So that has been occupied quite a lot of my time. And most recently, I've been working with sensor fusion. So that is data for vehicles, not only autonomous vehicles, but any kind of vehicles which has any kind of sensors on them, cameras, lidars. You may have seen that if you're sitting in a Waymo or in a Tesla. Finally, I've just come back from a presentation about domestic appliances, and that's Electrolux, another large Swedish company, where they gather data, of course, GDPR compliant from their customers, but some data is missing, some they've changed the devices, some unplugged the device. So what I'm trying to say is working with incomplete or partial data is an issue. So we get onto the topic of high value data sets. Just before that, this has always been an issue, but of course, with AI coming, which is extremely dependent on data, and I will come back to that, is we'd like to make the shift across Europe from our data sets published, some nice questions which I'll try to answer that, to are they really reusable across Europe? It doesn't mean there'll be one data set that you need to use across all of the countries, but are there subsets of data, for example, weather, water, things like this, which are usable across Europe, and are there particular data sets which have been heavily used in one country that other people can learn from? So we'll come back to that. The slide is sort of indicating something different, is that the EU, amongst many other things, is building out these gigafactories. So it's going to build hardware which is going to process data at scale. At least what most countries have one, some even have a couple. So each country has one. So where the data quality is quite important. There's no point building all these factories, buying all these GPUs and CPUs, and really building sort of like data centers. And if the data is not very good, so I hope we can agree that data is important. But I will try to drill down a little bit more than just do this fairly high level fluffy comments. Okay. So where it does matter, and I'm going to go back to the sensor fusion here. It's an obvious candidate, but you could just say in automated driving cases, or any driving, it just so happens with automating, there are sensors. So imagine you've got a camera in a vehicle which is going along, and then you're in the Nordic conditions, right? I mean, the camera is kind of useless, to be honest. It's all white. That might sound obvious, but you may use another modality, for example, the thermal camera or the LiDAR. You see these point clouds. So we've looked at this quite extensively. So there's one project we just finished where we actually took data quality to the next level. We'll describe that a little bit later. But obviously for regulation, for safety, for even the credibility of the whole industry, if the data is poor, then you're going to get situations, hopefully not quite as bad as that one, but people with AI can make up their own favorite scenarios. And I can just say, for example, in Sweden, if you do not have a thermal camera and high quality data, and a moose or an elk walks in front of the car in a white scene, you're not going to see it unless it's very late. Or indeed the data has not been trained to see a moose or an elk or even something else weird, right? That's kind of given. So the data quality, I hope you can agree, in this case a little bit more sensor fusion is important in this domain. I'll come back to this as a further examples, one level down. But I mean, this applies to many industries, but since this is at the top of my list, I can do it. So what is being done in the EU? Actually, after we did this in the Nordics, I reached out and the people in the Commission, data.europe.eu, sent me some links to some papers and reports, and I read them. So there is at least one here, high value data sets, best practices report, and they go through these findings, the bloodline of airline. So one thing about high value data sets is high value implies sharing and using. I mean, high value on its own doesn't mean anything if no one's using it or accessing it, right? For example, now with the high temperatures, we look at the weather apps. The data has been gathered by ground stations temperature, so it's got to be usable. And in this case, weather, for example, it's cross-boundary. Not all of the data is. It may be like road congestion in a particular country is cross-boundary. Although on Friday I heard that Luxembourg are so connected and there's so much traffic between them that a congestion in Luxembourg can definitely lead to congestion in France and vice versa. So in some cases the data is national, in some cases it's transnational. I think people can agree. Things like weather, water, groundwater, for example, is very hot now. So water is a shared resource, right? There's no border between the pipes, or at least in the flow of pipes. Maybe the pipes are owned by slightly different people. So that the EU looked at high value data sets. It did a little bit different approach to what we did, where they looked at across 7 different countries, what are the needs, what are the approaches, and they identify legal, organizational, technical practices, common highlight implementation barriers, and a roadmap for wider adoption. It's a little bit different to ours, and I will come back to that. So what did we do in the Nordics is we looked at a smaller subset of countries, and we looked more at public data. So what lessons can we learn from public data? Obviously, the public shares data, as I mentioned some of those cases before, air pollution, UV, things like this. And we did consider AI. So we did a slightly different thing from the EU. Of course, the goals are a little bit more different. The countries are landlocked more or less, I mean, except Iceland. And we looked at, for example, the barriers to adoption. We looked at the AI angle, which I've mentioned, and a little bit stronger on the recommendations. There's links in the presentations, and I'm more than happy to share both reports here. Just as a small example from the Nordic case, and I will come back to the comparison in the next slide. Where is the data relevant? So you can see, for example, some of the on the right-hand side in these graphics, groundwater, weather data, road cameras, road events, energy data, company announcements, you might say, some kind of slightly interesting ones there, flooding, work accidents, in some countries is public data and considered quite valuable. Insurance companies and preventative, company-specific data, energy data, air quality, cancer registries. I mean, that obviously needs to be high quality. Right? So we looked at, I think there's about 15 there, and I've actually been through more recently. Are they all still available and things like this? So this is the kind of data sets. It's quite a long, laborious process, indeed a little bit boring in some places. And then what's most important is it relevant for AI? So this report is at least 5 years old. What are the barriers for adoption, society value, estimated value for businesses, and then of course the cross-Nordic value. Why this? This is a Nordic data set, and it was also prepared for the Nordic Council of Ministers. Okay. Yeah. So just to go a little bit further in this is how open are they to each other? You may say, well, where Sweden and Norway share a border, then of course water might be relevant, whereas with Denmark we don't. So groundwater might be shared on less value. So we actually looked across these barriers, across these factors, which are at the bottom here, which has been working very well. So Iceland, for example, obviously they have geographic things, but we do share a lot of data with them as well, and vice versa. So it's a little bit complex there. You have these 5 factors here, and then you have how are they doing? Green is good, red is not great in this particular case. I don't remember which case this was, as well as between them. So there's each one between them and these. So that might seem a little bit confusing, but it's quite simple when you read the report. So the comparison between these kind of approaches, and I don't want to say one is better than or the other. So in the EU, of course, the audience is slightly different. I mean, we are more Nordic valued, but you can take some inference from that. The countries covered here were Czech Republic, Denmark, Estonia, Finland, Italy, Netherlands, Romania, and the Nordics here. I didn't write it in there. And you can see here, there is actually some of them are shared. For example, Denmark and Finland, obviously, are in the Nordics as well. This was done by 3 individuals, extremely good. It's referenced in the roadmap. And whereas we did this through national research organizations, or NCPs, ourselves, and a consultancy company for people who know Ramboll in Denmark. They're quite large in the Nordics. So it's done by slightly different people. And who was it paid by? So in the case of the EU roadmap, in the icon here, it's paid by the EU. For us, it was paid by our national nations. And I would say that the goals are slightly different, but complementary. So the goal was to implement high value datasets by best practices. Whereas our goal was different. It was to motivate data sharing using the examples from public data. So how would private companies share? They have their own businesses. They may not want to share. So they have their own goals. However, what can they benefit by sharing data? I mean, I'm not saying they share all the secrets and things like this, but there are ideas. I'll come back to that. So slightly different goals, if I'm honest. We looked a bit more at AI. We're a little bit weaker in regulation as they are. We would actually like touch regulation, whereas they use a little heavier. Suggestive actions, I think, were a little bit stronger, and there's some links to the reports for the slides later. Okay, legal and regulation. I'm going to skip through this relatively quickly because it's rather large, should have its own section. And indeed, there's been at least one NexusForum webinar on this. But if I go back to our data sets published, are they actually reusable at scale? Again, this comes back in the questions. There's an EU directives there, and there's the AI and data acts. So I don't really have time for this, but of course they have an impact on the value and usability of high value data sets. It's good to read the acts. It's good to understand where they are, and if indeed we're breaching any of the regulations. I don't think so. I checked, but however, this is definitely work in progress. And I refer back to NexusForum, which I do remember from Open Nebula had a nice seminar on Island data sovereignty. So it's a little bit cross the keys. But this cannot be ignored. So I just want to say one thing about data quality in the specific of automated driving. So people are very familiar with a technical readiness level, TRLs. We talk about them all the time in what kind of projects, TRL 3 to 5 and things, but why not a data readiness level? Okay, I mean, it's a fairly obvious thing to do. I'm not saying that there should be 9 levels, but in the case of automated driving, then you have, let's say, just for argument's sake, you have some hardware that goes on vehicles, it does some calibration, it does some data collection, it does some post data, that's before and after the driving. In some cases, the sensors are full of dirt, it has different machine learning algorithms, it has different sensing, it does some, and it does some detects some people. This is why it crashes into the new soil at the bottom. So what's important here in case of data and high value data is if anything happens at the bottom, it'll propagate all the way up. So this is often ignored, right? The machine learning people, the computer scientists get all the kudos, they write the good papers, but somebody there has to clean the sensors. And in this case, and in many data cases, if the data collection is done badly, you might as well forget the levels. For example, people forget which date it was, or whether it's summer or winter outside. Imagine you're doing internet use, it's boiling out at home, and everybody's out. Right? I mean, this metadata, what is the extra data needed? So data collection will propagate all the way through. That's not something I'll go into now, but it's just, this is why these arrows are here. And in this case, we can say, well, the data readiness level of this case is quite good. It's a snowy scene. We can see where we're supposed to go. Here, this is the LiDAR, is where it's sending out beams coming back. And here is a thermal camera, and you can say the data quality is a little bit poorer here. There is some banding. It's 3 thermal cameras put together, so you see these effects. You can still see the person, so hopefully we're not driving into them, and we can still see cars which are parked, which are warmer. But you could say, and I don't really have time to go for this, but I can give you the references, that the data quality for the thermal camera is a bit lower. Why does this matter in terms of industry? You can say, well, give me better data. Before I start to do all the machine learning, if you're giving me this data, which is a little bit inadequate, it's not in this case, is you can simply give the data back to the provider. That will save you a lot of time and effort upstream. So I pay for this, or I've gathered this, but the data is insufficient to use. So what am I doing? I'm going skipping right from the bottom to the top. Right? I mean, many people, they know this Pareto rule. You spend 80% of the time doing 20% of the tasks and 20% of the time doing 80% of the tasks. This is a classic example. I'm not saying in this case the data should be sent back, However, it does say it's a little bit low quality, and that's fine. The thermal camera was, there were three thermal cameras stitched together. Okay, so that was a quick walkthrough. I know it's a little bit of an abrupt ending, but I hope I can motivate data quality and why it's important, and a little bit of a landscape across Europe.
Thank you, Ian. I think this was a really interesting overview. I have to say, I also personally really like the data readiness, the introduction of the data readiness level, because as you mentioned, the data is important, but maybe the quality of it needs to also advance with time, but also the changing environment, because you mentioned weather and water and different resources that are impacting the collection of the data. But what we also witness is the changing of these elements as well. So I think it's also questionable how the previous data actually can serve the predictability if these factors are changing. But as you mentioned a couple of times, this topic is so wide that we can only touch upon certain things and kind of provide this food for thought or ideas for the next webinars and next topics, because there is so much to discuss. As you mentioned at the beginning, we do have already some questions that we will also like to introduce now in the session and try to kind of go to the nitty-gritties of at least some aspects of this domain. So yeah, you can switch to yes, thank you. So the first question would be, are Europe's high-value data sets truly discoverable and reusable today, or are metadata and interoperability um, still the biggest barriers? So what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I apologize for my slow screen transitions and touching the keyboard. I'll try to keep my
No
fingers off.
worries, no worries.
Yeah, so it's an extremely good question, and I'm going to say that every time because it's kind of an automated tick. I say it's a good question. In principle, they should be, at least in the EU, if they follow the FAIR principle. There is a screenshot there: findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable. I would question whether all those of each of those attributes are done as well as they could be. Findable, definitely. Accessible, you could say it's quite close. Interoperable, I would question that, and reusable, I would definitely question that. People who write research papers, they say, oh, it's reusable, you can just reuse it, but you find that things are old and things. So I would say that's a good start. However, it's not really enough, I would say. So the second point of mine, it's the uptake, to be honest. You should do this. You have to do this. You have to write a data management plan in the EU. For people outside of the EU, we have quite kind of strict deadlines on how you write the proposals and make sure the data is reusable, that it's fair. But what you should really focus on is the uptake. So that is it useful? And that's why I go back to the public data sets, because they have to be useful. So the answer is yes, they could be better. But I would just zoom to the end, like with the automated driving, can people use that? Then you can still do refinements later. So I would say discover and reusable, if they got the money from EU funding and did followed FAIR, they would be okay-ish. Metadata is a big issue. I think we're still talking about that a little bit, and I will come back to that from the road view. As a test of this seminar, I went back through all of the public data sets since the and most of them are. With commercial ones, it's a little bit harder to follow up if they changed, if they added data, if they still maintain it, if they got bought. Sometimes companies get bought for the data. So I would say it's reasonable in the EU. In the private sector, I'm less sure. And there are, it's a little bit answer, I feel long answer, so I'm just kind of rambling. To some degree, yes, but I don't really know, except in certain areas, about the private data. A little bit of a vague answer, I'm sorry about that.
No, but I mean, it's okay. I don't think we can have like a straight answer for everything, especially when it comes to the uptake, because again, a lot of factors involved. As you said, there is already a lot of data available if we focus on the projects, especially stemming from the projects in terms of their results and so on. But then the uptake and the actual use are still also I would also say at an individual level. By individual, I also mean like the entities or organizations, because as you showcase, like in the case of the Nordics, it was the organizations that were kind of in charge of collecting the data, but also applying it to real life situations. Whereas for the EU, it was kind of more like a group or a smaller team. So there are also different approaches to this uptake. But let's have a look at the next question. So
So, sorry.
coming to AI, yeah, please go ahead.
No, no, please, you read it.
So what makes a high-value data set truly valuable for AI? Public services, research, and innovation. So again, speaking about uptake as well, not just the having it openly available.
Yeah, in the last answer, I would just say uptake. Here, I would use the word usable, and there are slightly different things there. So, if the data is usable, and that maybe not perfect, that's a good start. So, for AI, obviously, if you give it better data, if you've trained it again, if you update the data with your experiences, it will make it better. So, you need to be able to start very quickly and make it usable. People will give up if they have got to spend a long time fiddling. So I would say that for public services, I think that the situation is quite good. I would say for research, it's a bit mixed. It would be quite interesting to go through all of the EU projects and see which data is still available, whether it's in Zenodo, whether it's in just trying to think of the EU sharing platform. I know we have one in Sweden, but not just openly available. I think the other thing is cross-referenceable. It's a bit of a mouthful that. So you can imagine that many data sets don't live on their own. For example, driving is highly dependent on the weather, or the level of groundwater is is dependent on the temperature. So you quite often need to cross-reference them to be useful. And one thing that I would sort of like to mention, you need some knowledge of the data. I mean, weather is probably okay, but I don't know what the average level of the groundwater should be. I mean, you would need some experts, so at least one expert to explain. I mean, and you could maybe get away with some AI programs. So one thing is usable. The one thing is cross-reference with other data sets. That's one reason why the public data sets are available. So if you're a business, you'll be constantly looking at these, right? And another thing is the programmability. Now, this is kind of an interesting thing. And I just chose two examples here. Which one example is in the Nordic reports, that is hackathons, get people going. And what we see then, I mean, hackathon already feels like an old concept, right? We used to do hackathons 5 years ago. But if you don't get the people with their hands on using the data, and testing it and perhaps giving feedback to the providers, you will not reach high value, you may not. So I just look now at what's happening in the Nordics, and just a couple of weeks or 3 weeks ago, there was a future crisis management from our Digital Earth Sweden, the kind of satellite mapping organizations. So I skipped to the last point there. So I also mentioned one other thing here. There is a small startup here. I don't get paid for them. I don't have shares. I do know the CEO, but they did something called Feature Store. And that is basically when you do AI training, or indeed non-AI training, you can simply import a feature as needed. Right? So you can say, I want the weather, I want to see the number of people using the public transport system. And here what they put life is life without a feature store. So, you have you have data silos, you have lots of problems spending doing other things. So if you can simply import a feature, this is not import a data set, it's import a particular feature for your problem. You can make life a little bit easier, which is related to the hackathon to some degrees. If you're going to use these data sets, so just to go back to the question, what makes high value set truly valuable is the usability. And here's an example that you do some programming, you get people together talking, as well as you use some features from some companies. I'm not extolling the virtues of Hopsworks and their thing, but I think it was a nice solution to answer this question.
Thank you, Ian. I think we can move on to the next question, actually, speaking about standards and interoperability. So, yes, how can common metadata standards and cross-border interoperability improve the use of high-value data sets across this ecosystem?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. And I said I was going to say that a few times, and I just did again. So I would say the situation is mixed. If I look at Finland, sometimes we're 11 million and we have these large companies and they're 5 million, but they're very innovative. They thought about these questions. So data management, so sorry, yeah. So it's a little bit mixed, to be honest. I would say Finland is ahead in the metadata indexing of the public data. So not only they've realized that they've got to make data available on a national level, by the way, because not many countries are doing that too on a national level. They provide terabytes of data where they have all of the post-project data available. So we've just started to copy them because we think it's a good idea that when the project finishes, they should be available. But going back to the question is that the metadata is available. For example, what were the temperatures like and what were the conditions like when that data was gathered? So that's an extremely important aspect. Just as as an aside, so from the data from the European ones, I went through some of them, and they mentioned the metadata. So that's extremely important. So it's, I would say, how common? Not much, except in Finland where they're a little bit ahead. So the archival of data, as I mentioned, so as I mentioned the project, we will archive them, all of the data from the row view for many of our EU projects. We're testing this now, it'll be available after the summer. So one thing is you sort of put the data there, kind of copy it as you would do with Amazon Web Services, and then add the metadata, which may happen. But if you have the metadata and you upload it as well as the kind of raw bits and bytes, that will be good. Getting there, but I think it's a second thought for most people. Oh, we get the data and then say, oh my God, we don't have enough metadata to make it really useful. Perhaps my answer is mixed, poor to average, if I was to give it a ranking. Yeah, and as I mentioned, so just the last point there, we're trying to do what the Finnish are doing. We have a national data initiative and we will try to do that. I think we're still gathering all our metadata, but it's a good question.
Thanks. Again, I think that there's a lot of aspects to cover here. So also sorry for drilling you like this and then like trying to extract like very specific answers when in fact there is no specific answer to these questions. It's open to discussion. I would also like to switch to the trustworthiness. So with our next question, speaking about data challenges, so what are the challenges that are limiting development and then also the deployment of trustworthy AI applications across this continuum?
About drilling me, you should drill me because this question answers maybe a little bit revealing than the previous ones. So I have a lot to say about this in 40 minutes. If I don't curb my answers, they are going to be rather verbose. But no, you should, and they're good questions. And we didn't agree to say that before this. So we call them the barriers, which is terminology issue. And in the Nordic reports, we were quite clear what is the barriers for adoption. And in fact, because we had so many entities, we simply asked them. I mean, we can imagine what are the barriers, but what are the barriers for them? So make input is not often prioritized. It's trivial, but people are simply not that interested in that. I mean, and I think there's at least 8 or 9 barriers in the report. I didn't extract all of them, just to give you a couple of examples. So there's often a lack of knowledge about the value of data in public organizations, especially with regard to the potential value generation of AI solutions on government-owned data sets. I'm just reading this now. The results in a lack of funding and not a prioritization of resource and time in governmental agencies. We've ticked the box, the data is available, and that's usually not quite enough. So it should be a priority because if you do good data, people will come and ask for it. They will want API keys. They may want to download it. They may want to get it on a cloud service faster. Like if you write good software, people use it. If you put it on GitHub and nobody uses it, and your life is easier, but nobody's using it, which is not good for the EU. However, if you're still updating or maintaining software from 30 years ago, it showed you had a good choice, so people still keep going back to it. So I would say one barrier, and I won't go through all of them just for looking at time, it should be prioritized. The data is really an asset. We always say, oh, data is the new oil and stuff, but is it really prioritized? I think in the public institutes where the solution is relatively good, it's still not the priority. They typically outsource these to strong consultancy companies if they don't have them internally. Some do, some don't. Public available government datasets may not be reusable for AI solutions. This is an interesting, so I just decided to go into the second ones. So this is, again, a mixed ones. I would say they're slightly better, but the standardized data formats, each one will choose a format and or a solution according to their own needs. Some may want to be able to read the data, sort of open, some may want binary data because it's faster access, easy to move around. That does not mean you should all use the same one, but if they interoperate, people need to have certain importers for each kind of data set type. And unfortunately, the EU report didn't bring that up enough, but these barriers are they're quite low. There's not a lot of academic value in them, but they're showstoppers. If you don't get them correct, it won't happen. And there are more barriers in the Nordic reports. Just to go onto this, particularly for the cloud edge continuum, I think it is important to keep looking at the laws and to understand what's needed. You don't want to have data sets which are illegal or don't follow the laws or not compliant, because once you put a compliant, especially in Europe, stamp on the data, people are more likely to use it. We're quite a bit suspicious of things we don't trust it or have the CE mark on them. I would say talking to the regulators is quite important as well. So this is not in the barriers, but this is answering your question. So for example, again, I'm sorry, I'm giving a Swedish one. Our telecom regulator and our digital agency have merged because the regulators got with the power, but they are strong and legal, but they're not that great at computer science or data issues. So they've merged the digital government agency because one is legal and one is technical. Another challenge, and I'll be very quick, is this kind of unforeseen circumstances. I think what most of Europe is going through a heat wave, and if you gather data, you should be ready for this. So the weather now may make lots of data analysis wrong. It was done at the wrong temperatures if they're using data from the winter. So these unforeseen circumstances, the earthquake in Venezuela, maybe affect the oil prices, for example. And one thing I mentioned just in the beginning, the last point here before I get to the last question, is the things at the bottom, the kind of laborious, painful things, the data collection, how it's done, how is it timestamps, if things are aligned or not aligned. If that's not done correctly, you will get poor quality data. And this is especially true in the cloud continuum, because we would like to talk IoT to data center. That's the whole point, right? It is that the continuum includes everything from a little device to very large processing. And if the data flows, for example, from a small device to a data center and it's poor quality, it's useless and you wasted your time. So for the cloud continuum, I would say cloud data collection is very important and verifiable data collection.
Thank you, Ian. So you mentioned this connection or like interchange between the people behind the recommendations and roadmaps, and also the regulators, because they are drawing on technical experience, obviously, to create regulations and understand better what it's needed. But we, being from a project and also trying to be part of this side, creating the roadmaps and recommendations. Also are trying to kind of feed this knowledge to the regulators, which brings me to the last question, and basically the recommendations, or let's say your insight and opinion on what should be the top priority over the next 5 years to kind of understand the full potential, but also unlock it, so to provide this uptake of the high value data sets for AI and the cloud edge ecosystem.
Yeah, it's important to have kind of a roundup of what should we be doing. Just to answer that, we did have the regulator attending a couple of our webinars, and I'm in contact with them, and it's them which tell me about this merge with the digital agency and them. So I agree. All of the government agencies that are involved, even the ones which are interpreting EU laws, it's important to get especially in this case, to have them on board. So to answer the question, I think good quality data matters. It's a trivial thing, but what does it really mean? Again, this is probably a bit too long for this, and now since we're a little bit higher, but we have drilled down, right down. So with good data quality, you can do a lot. I think it should be obvious for things like weather, water, pollution. That's important. So there is an incentive to provide high quality, and there are people who realize this. Maybe a little bit too late. At least I'm doing a very Swedish perspective. I know that they're outside, but there's no point in me saying things which happen in Slovenia because I don't know. But at RISE, we've been working with data quality or data readiness, if you want to call that, from 2017, and AI Sweden have a data readiness lab. So that's important, right? Make sure that the quality is good. Maybe a third party can validate your data. And just because I didn't want to be too Swedish centric, I looked at the National Data Library in the UK, and they actually have pointers to good quality data sets as best practices. Best practices are quite good. Funding helps. But I would say, if you tell me of one good high quality data set or famous data set, people might say Kaggle, they might say some kind of Netflix challenge. So I would say is to raise the profile of good quality, raise the success stories in the EU. EU is quite good at marketing. Again, I put my EU hat on here, is have a couple of data sets that will be usable or examples, or, for example, we used all the weather in the heat wave to predict how many people, fell ill in the recent heat wave, for example. Have a few success stories, I think would help a lot. That would motivate people to use the data for public good, as well as for small companies and the products that they offer. So I would say there's a slight imbalance between using data for the private and making companies more adaptable, profitable, leaner to public good. But what we've noticed is people do really care about the public good quite a lot, and people are quite moralistic and would like to work on this. So in short, I would say have a few success stories. And maybe the commission or our national agencies is not the source. It could be the BBC or Deutsche Welle or something, and that they say, oh, this data was gathered by NexusForum, so that they report data. So success or visible results of using ideally with a little reference at the bottom of their news item or the journalist Substack piece or whatever, I think would help. We live in a media age. We follow other people. We like success.
Thank you, Ian. So if I understood, also stepping out of this let's say regular lane of communicating just to the regulators, and what I personally really like about the project is also finding a way to the general public, and also kind of making it easier to understand what these kind of projects do and what's their impact also for non-technical audience, as you said, like success stories, or I don't know, a portion or a documentary, Deutsche Welle, or some other media, just explaining what's currently happening and what this, let's say, roadmap for the next 5 years or something is also how impacting all of us, I would say, because these topics, although they may seem very technical, they indeed are relevant and important to all of us also as, let's say, just citizens or sometimes non-technical persons. But without going into a whole new discussion, which is, I think, very easy here because again, so many topics and lanes to kind of follow into a new topic. Um, I will conclude this session for today. And again, you can also check out Nexus Forum website, but also Cloud Edge for IoT, where you will find more videos, where you will also find perspective from our Japanese and South Korean colleagues, which I think is also a valuable addition to what we discussed here from European perspective. So, Ian, I would like to thank you very much for your time and your great insights. Do you have anything else to add for the end of the session?
No, thank you very much for having me. I look forward to reading the results and outcomes and roadmap and recommendations from Nexus Forum. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye bye.